Columbus Day came and went this week, and as it is with every other historical event, we now have to have a conversation about why it's idiotic to hold a man who lived in the 1400s to our modern standards of morality. I hate to tell you this, but I can guarantee that in the future, the generations that follow will think that you are immoral. Probably for something we don't even think about, something like eating meat or driving gas-powered vehicles, maybe mining the earth for oil and minerals, something that, in the future, society won't have to do and will consider our civilization backwards and savage for having participated in. Columbus was a man of his time who did a great thing. We don't celebrate him for the way he treated the natives, but for the courage it took to open the world. In my opinion, to quote Tony Soprano,
"He discovered America is what he did. He was a brave Italian explorer, and in this house, Christopher Columbus is a hero. End of story."
I'm Tyler Chrestman. Welcome to the Chrestman Conversation. Well, hello, everyone. So we have a couple good topics this week. We're going to talk about Nehisi Coates did an interview on CBS that really demonstrates how little he knows about anything. And then we're going to talk about a video of Kamala Harris that surfaced this week from a couple years ago where she was talking about how bad Columbus Day is. And both those topics are pretty fun. They both happened kind of earlier in the week, so it might seem like this a little late, but that's just the way it is. You know, when things happen on Friday and then we got to wait till next Friday, sometimes we're getting the news just a little bit behind where I'd like to. But these are pretty interesting topics, so we're going to talk about both of them. But first, our favorite comment from last week comes from our number one listener, Kevin, who said, quote, "Another great conversation. Do yourselves a favor. Watch and learn," end quote. Kevin, you're the best. I always appreciate the support, and I really do appreciate everyone who listens. And I think Kevin's probably our number one listener. It'd be a fight. There's a couple of people out there who comment on a lot of our stuff, but Kevin is a great supporter, and I appreciate you. Okay, so for the first topic, those who don't know, Ta-Nehisi Coates. I would be surprised if you do not know him. And he's kind of a big deal, or he was kind of a big deal. He really came to prominence around 2015 after the BLM and Ferguson riots. He wrote a book. Actually, I think it's behind me here. I wonder if I have a copy. I think I do. Yep, let me grab it. Hold on, I'll show you. Oh, first, actually, before we get any further, look at Winnie. She was being nice today. She's barely meowing at all. Being great. It's nice to have this library behind me for a reference point. Okay, so there's a book. As you can see, I had some bookmarks in here from a long time ago. Okay. So this is Ta-Nehisi Coates. This is probably his most famous book. This is Between the World and Me. I remember reading this back in 2015 when it came out, and I had a lot of takeaways from the book. I thought it was interesting. It's very well written. There's a lot of people who will try and argue, I think wrongly, that Ta-Nehisi Coates is not a good writer. I think he's a pretty good writer. I think a lot of people will use the term purple to describe his writing, which basically just means it's over-emotional sometimes, which is true. I think the book is well written. I also think it demonstrates that he is a bad person. I don't know a nicer way to say that. I think that there are some parts in that book that are just absolutely wild. He talks about, the big one is, he talks about 9/11, saying that the firefighters and the police officers who were killed during 9/11 weren't human to him. And he remembers watching, he was in New York, he was smoking marijuana and watching the towers crumble, and he didn't feel anything at all. And I'm like, that is a sociopath at the very least, a person who could watch a tragedy like that. I don't care who it happens to. It could happen to people I detest, but it's still a lot of people being murdered, and to say that you didn't feel anything for them is just insane. And so I think I have a bookmark in here. It just says, "Fuck that." I wonder what that is. Oh yeah, it's I figured it was the September 11th part. And so anyway, to summarize the book, Ta-Nehisi Coates writes about, it's a book about race relations. It's written as a letter to his son. And basically in my mind, it just seems like it's always that issue where if you want to look at the world through a certain lens, you can find that problem anywhere. So for example, if you look at the world through a racial lens and you're looking at it through that lens, you're going to see racism everywhere. So he gives a great example in here of a woman who pushes his son. Some white woman pushes his son, and he basically talks about her as though she's the biggest racist. She would never push a white child. She would never do this. It's because my son's black body didn't mean anything to her, blah, 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 blah. Again, he knows nothing about this woman. She might just be an asshole who would definitely push a white child. But he attributes racism to her. And also, nothing bad ever seems to happen to this guy. It just, everything is racist. He's the kind of guy, I always say, if he'd walk down the street and trip on the sidewalk, it's because institutional racism led that sidewalk to be crooked. You know what I mean? He finds racism in every little corner of the world. So he wrote this book. It's a good book in terms of the way it's written. I think it's a bad book in terms of the message that it relays to the people. So anyway, Ta-Nehisi Coates, he was huge for a minute. He wrote a couple books, and then he disappeared. He's disappeared the last couple of years, but he has resurfaced with a new book called The Message. And I haven't read it yet. I will read it at some point, I'm sure. But from what I hear, and the parts of it that I have seen excerpts from and listened to people talk about, it comes across as wildly anti-Semitic. It says that Israel's treatment of the Palestinians is a moral crime, and he doesn't understand why the U.S. stands idly by while Israel basically practices apartheid in the Middle East. And we're talking about this today because of this interview that he did. We want to talk a little bit about the interview, and that's just a lot of backstory about who Ta-Nehisi Coates is in case you don't know. And I want to play for you briefly here. It's actually a couple minutes long, but this is a really good clip, and I just want everyone to watch this, and then we're going to talk about it. So here's a couple minutes of the clip, and then we will discuss.
Conflict, and there's so many quote-unquote issues to be dealt with.
Ta-Nehisi, I want to dive into the Israel-Palestine section of the book. It's the largest section of the book. And I have to say, when I read the book, I imagine if I took your name out of it, took away the awards and the acclaim, took the cover off the book, the publishing house goes away, the content of that section would not be out of place in the backpack of an extremist. And so then I found myself wondering, why does Ta-Nehisi Coates, who I've known for a long time, read his work for a long time, very talented, smart guy, leave out so much? Why leave out that Israel is surrounded by countries that want to eliminate it? Why leave out that Israel deals with terror groups that want to eliminate it? Why not detail anything of the first and the second intifada, the cafe bombings, the bus bombings, the little kids blown to bits? And is it because you just don't believe that Israel in any condition has a right to exist?
Well, I would say...
Okay, so real briefly, I might jump back in there for just a second, but I wanted to say, so the interviewer here, a lot of things, first of all, this is amazing. Ta-Nehisi Coates is treated as someone who is anointed by the left. He's an untouchable. You can't talk bad about Ta-Nehisi Coates because somehow that'll make you a racist or some sort of bigot or just a bad person, and he's one of those guys that you cannot talk bad about in the circles on the left and still be friendly. So he goes on CBS, which he's probably not prepared for, to get in a rather hostile or aggressive question right off the jump, because this is a promotion for his new book, and he's the kind of guy who he doesn't debate because he doesn't have good ideas and he's not a quick thinker on his feet, and he doesn't go and do hostile interviews. He only goes to friendly places, CBS being one of them. So he probably wasn't prepared for this right off the jump. And the anchor or the host here, and I can't remember how to say his last name. It's Tony Dukubali or something like that. I don't know how to say his last name, but he's one of the three co-hosts here. And I don't watch these kind of shows. I think they're mostly trash, so I'm not familiar with the guy. But he does a great job just pushing back on this question, which Ta-Nehisi Coates is not expecting at all. And so I'm going to play a little bit more. But I just wanted to point out that this is not something that happens because people like Ta-Nehisi Coates or Ibram X. Kendi or Robin DiAngelo, they don't do interviews with people who don't agree with every word that they say because they don't have good ideas. They can't defend their ideas. So right off the jump, Ta-Nehisi Coates is on the back foot. Here we go. Let's play a little more.
Say the perspective that you just outlined, there is no shortage of that perspective in American media. That's the first thing I would say. I am most concerned always with those who don't have a voice, with those who don't have the ability to talk. I have asked repeatedly in my interviews whether there is a single network, mainstream organization in America with a Palestinian American bureau chief or correspondent who actually has a voice to articulate their part of the world. I've been a reporter for 20 years. The reporters of those who believe more sympathetically about Israel and its right to exist don't have a problem getting their voice out. But what I saw in Palestine, what I saw on the West Bank, what I saw in Haifa in Israel, what I saw in the South Hebron Hills, those were the stories that I have not heard. And those were the stories that I was most occupied with. I wrote a 260-page book. It is not a treatise on the entirety of the conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis.
But if you were to read this book, you would be left wondering, why does any of Israel exist? What a horrific place, committing horrific acts on a daily basis. So I think the question is central and key. If Israel has a right to exist, and if your answer is no, then I guess the question becomes, why do the Palestinians have a right to exist? Why do 20 different Muslim countries have a right to exist?
My answer is that no country in this world establishes its ability to exist through rights. Countries establish their ability to exist through force, as America did. And so I think this question of right to Israel does exist. It's a fact. The question of its right is not a question that I would be faced with any other country.
But you write a book that delegitimizes the pillars of Israel. It seems like an effort to topple the whole building of it. So I come back to the question, and it's what I struggled with throughout this book. What is it that so particularly offends you about the existence of a Jewish state that is a Jewish safe place and not any of the other states out there?
There's nothing that offends me about a Jewish state. I am offended by the idea of states built on ethnocracy, no matter where they are.
Muslim included.
I would not want a state where any group of people laid down their citizenship rights based on ethnicity. The country of Israel is a state in which half the population exists on one tier of citizenship, and everybody else that's ruled by Israelis exists on another tier, including Palestinian Israeli citizens. The only people that exist on that first tier are Israeli Jews. Why do we support that? Why is that okay? I'm the child of Jim Crow. I'm the child of people that were born into a country where that was exactly.
Okay, so I feel like that's a good place to stop because they talked for a couple more minutes, but that really talks about what I want to understand. So I love that the host here just is pushing back. Like, hey, there's one Jewish country in the world. Why don't they have a right to exist? Coates makes the argument that, well, actually they practice apartheid. The Israeli Jews live on one tier of society. Everyone else lives on another tier of society. Coates doesn't seem to know anything about Israel. I understand that he just did some time there. He went over and had a visit to the West Bank, and he walked through Israel, but apparently he missed some basic things, which I think we'll just go through right now. So 20% of the Israeli population are Arabs. They are non-Jewish Arabs. They have all of the same rights as their Israeli counterparts who are Jewish. They can hold office. They can vote. They can do everything that the Jewish people in Israel can do. They have in the Knesset, they have, I believe, 1/5 of the Knesset is Arab. So the Knesset is basically Congress in Israel. That's what they call it. And 1/5 of them are Arab. It's not Jewish. They are Arab because 1/5 of the population is Arab. They've voted in almost 20% of the Knesset is non-Jewish Arab people. I believe the majority Muslim, but I think there's some Christians in there as well. When he talks about, we didn't play this part, but he goes on to talk about there are certain roads that Palestinians cannot drive down. Well, this is actually not really true. There are checkpoints on many roads that Palestinians have to go through to get in and out of Israel. This is because Palestinians have weaponized cars against Israel. They have made car bombs. They have blown people up. So they used to blow up buses during the intifadas, which Coates seems to have forgotten about. So Palestinians have to go through checkpoints now to make sure that they don't have explosives or weapons, but they're allowed to go in and out of Israel. There are, however, roads that Jews cannot drive down because they will be murdered. Because while 20% of the Israeli population is Arab, 0% of the Palestinian population is Jewish because they would be murdered. This is the wildest thing in the world. When in South Africa, in apartheid, black people did not have rights that white people did in South Africa. They didn't. They were not in the government. They didn't get to vote. They didn't have a say in how their lives were lived. They paid different taxes. They did different things. It is not the same. This is not true in Israel at all. It delegitimizes how terrible apartheid was in South Africa, how bad the Jim Crow state was in the United States. Israel doesn't even compare to that in the 50s, from basically 1865 to 1964. It doesn't compare to any of that. So when he starts talking about this, all it does is pretend that the Palestinian people are the victims of Israel, which is not the case. They are not. Palestine is not the good guy in this situation. They're not. I don't know what to tell you. The aggression that happens in the Middle East comes from one direction and one direction only, and that is from the surrounding countries into Israel. It doesn't go the other way. You can say, well, Israel's marching through Gaza right now. Israel's in Lebanon right now. They're fighting Hezbollah in Lebanon. They took over parts of Jordan. They took over parts of Egypt. They did these things. And you say, yes, every time they are attacked, Israel has won the war. That's what happens. But they don't start the wars. They don't. Look historically at all the wars fought since 1947 with the creation of Israel, and who started the wars every single time? The surrounding Muslim countries started the war every single time. Israel happens to finish the war every single time, but it's like a bully picking on the small child. The small child socks him in the face, knocks him down, starts beating him up, and then the bully cries foul. No. You don't get to do this. So when Coates writes this book, which I can't wait, we're going to get it. I don't want to buy it. I don't want to support it. So what I'll do is I'm going to wait until it'll probably be next year that I wind up reading it, because there's a giant book fair in St. Louis every year where I buy 100 books, and I'm sure that it'll be in there because no doubt a bunch of people will buy it, and then a bunch of people will donate it, and it'll be making the rounds at the Goodwill before long. I'm pretty sure that's how I got this one. I got it at the book fair probably the year after it was published, maybe 2016. I'm not 100% sure. He likes to think of himself as the modern-day James Baldwin, but I hate to tell him he's not nearly as good and certainly not as smart. James Baldwin was a very smart man. Anyway, so I can't wait to do a takedown of the book. This whole thing, the fact that this guy is brought out, Ta-Nehisi Coates, is brought out and lauded as some sort of public... He won a MacArthur Genius Grant. Why that guy won it, I don't have any idea, because he's not a genius. He's not that smart. He's a good writer. He is a good writer, but his ideas are bad. He can't defend his ideas. He doesn't know what he's talking about, and this is basic stuff. I don't know what to tell you. This is not... I've never won a MacArthur Genius Grant, and I guarantee you, if Ta-Nehisi Coates and I were to have a conversation, a debate on this topic, I think I could make him look like a fool. I don't think he knows anything about the conflict. All he knows is, because he looks through the terrible leftist perspective of victimizer and victim, he sees the Palestinians suffer and the Israel is prosperous, and therefore the Palestinians are the good guys because they've obviously been oppressed. It's the only reason that they would be living in poverty. It's a terrible way to understand anything because it's not true. Palestinians can work in Israel. Jews can't even go into Gaza or areas of the West Bank without being murdered. It is not equivalent whatsoever. And there's another interview, I should have pulled this up, where Coates says when the walls came down on October 7th of last year, when the walls came down, if he was one of those Palestinians, he doesn't know if he would have been able to resist running in there and participating. We're going to take this guy seriously as some sort of person who's going to lecture us on morality when he can't say he doesn't know if he'd be able to resist running in and murdering and raping and pillaging like the Palestinian people did when the wall came down on Israel? No, I don't think I'll listen to a word he has to say because he is a morally confused and corrupt man. I just don't believe he's a good person. Again, we can go all the way back to 2015. Watching 1,000 people be murdered, sitting there smoking pot and saying, yeah, I don't feel anything for those people. That's a wild statement to say. 343 firefighters died that day. He doesn't feel anything for them. He thinks they're part of a system that discriminates against him. It makes him rich and famous, the system. Makes him rich and famous. He doesn't have to do anything except write shitty books for a living. But somehow the system is so built against the black people that Ta-Nehisi Coates just get to be a millionaire doing nothing productive. It's ridiculous. Anyway, there's another reason I wanted to talk about this interview, and it is because of the aftermath. So CBS, this is where our journalism is. This has happened in the New York Times, and now it's happening at CBS. The New York Times published an op-ed a number of years ago, I think when Donald Trump was still president. Oh. Excuse me. A number of years ago when Donald Trump was president, Tom Cotton wrote an op-ed that the New York Times published. The New York Times had a meltdown that a Republican was given the right to publish an op-ed in the New York Times. They actually fired their op-ed, the editor, and it was a whole big deal. And it lets you know that newsrooms are now run by children, leftist children, who cannot handle differing opinions. This happened at CBS. They had a meltdown because this anchor pushed back on Ta-Nehisi Coates. The CBS conducted an internal review of the host, and they involve standards and practices as well as the race and culture unit to make sure that he didn't violate any standards of the network. This is the state of journalism. One hostile interview, and an entire network embarrasses itself with the blowback. It is pathetic that you allow these people to say, oh my gosh, someone didn't agree with everything that our network says it should agree with. We had an author on who's a pillar of the left, and somebody asked them some tough questions in an interview. We need to sanction that person. We need an apology. We need to get this person off of the show and into some counseling where he can learn how to be a better leftist. It is an embarrassment to journalism that these people are allowed to do this. First of all, shame on CBS. If you're in charge of that network, and these people come to you and say, we can't believe this happened, you need to do something, I'd say, you're absolutely right. Why don't you hand in your resignation? Oh, you don't want to quit? Then shut up and go back to work. I don't want to hear your nonsense. The idea that you're going to cater to these people, you're going to placate these people, you're going to give them what they want, which is this entire review, it's an embarrassment. That's not how you handle people like this. The second that someone comes up to you and say, my snowflake feelings were hurt, you say, okay, I don't care. Go do your job. That's the response. That's what you say. That's what you say. Or you just say, okay, feel free to resign. We don't need you. There's a lot of people here who can do copy. We don't really need a person here who is going to say, oh, these Republicans hurt my feelings. No, sorry. There's no place for you in journalism if you can't handle a differing of opinion. In fact, it should be your job to look for differing opinions and then show both sides of an issue. That should be what you try and do if you are going to call yourself a journalist. I, for example, would never call myself a journalist. I'm not a journalist. All I do is give my opinion about things. That's what I do. I have a rather conservative opinion. I give my rather conservative opinion. That's kind of where I'm at. I would never call myself a journalist. These people call themselves journalists. They pretend to be journalists, and yet they can't handle some slight pushback on one person because that's just too much for the network to withstand. It's an embarrassment. I don't know what else to say. I just think that journalism, if it really wants to survive, if you want to take network news seriously again, you have got to allow people who you don't agree with to have a voice. And the people you do agree with, you should be tougher on them. You should steelman the other side of an argument and hit them with it during interviews. You should make the other side of the case, no matter who's on your show. You should argue with the left. You should argue with the right. That's how you get to good answers. That's how you find out who has good ideas. Who can articulate and defend their ideas are the people with the good ideas. Because if you can't articulate and defend your idea, you don't know anything. You know a talking point. This is what happens whenever someone pushes back on someone like AOC, for example. is the second that you ask her a question that requires more than reading the headlines, she doesn't know what she's talking about. She'll go, well, I'm no expert. Well, then shut up. That's the answer. If you don't know what you're talking about, shut up. That's what you do. If somebody asks me a question and I don't know the answer, I say, well, I don't really know. That's not that hard. It's just an easy thing to do. Most people just feel like they have to nonsense and bullshit their way through it. You don't. You can just say, I don't know. And that's a fine answer. But anyway, I digress. My tip for CBS would be to fire these people who are making noise in your journalism department and hire people who are interested in pushing back against the established powers on the left and the right and forcing people to come up with good answers. That would be my advice. It's free of charge. Feel free to take it and run with it. Okay, we are at the 24-minute mark. So I want to real quick just talk about this thing I kind of hinted to in the intro, which is Kamala Harris and the Indigenous Peoples Day versus Columbus Day. All right, I just want to play the clip. We'll start there.
It is an honor, of course, to be with you this week as we celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day. Every October, the United States has recognized the voyage of the European explorers who first landed on the shores of the Americas. But that is not the whole story. Those explorers ushered in a wave of devastation for tribal nations, perpetrating violence, stealing land, and spreading disease. We must not shy away from this shameful past.
Okay, so there's a reason why I play this, and it's because I get annoyed every year. So I guess Kamala Harris made those remarks a number of years ago. I actually don't know how long ago. I think it was a couple years ago, possibly 2020 when she was running for president, somewhere around there. And this is part of, that was shared, by the way, by the Daily Mail. So this is part of a mindset that is entirely anti-Western civilization. There's a push. It's been in recent years. You can go back. I wrote an article in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, which talked about taking down statues and why I'm very anti-removing statues. So it started off, there were statues of Confederates, be Robert E. Lee, but then it was people like Columbus. And I remember, I think I wrote the article about removing a statue of Columbus. And I said that I think this is ridiculous. I think it's ridiculous to go through history and say this person did a bad thing, no statue for them. Every person throughout history until 5 minutes ago, when judged by the standard of someone living in the United States in the year 2024, would be a bad person. I'm sorry, I don't know what to tell you. You go back far enough, there's slavery. You go back less than that, there's racism at a level we don't even understand. And then you have sexism, you have homophobia, you have all these things that today we'd say, oh my gosh, I can't believe that person would say such a thing. They made the gay joke, or, oh, this person made some sort of misogynistic remark about women. Wow, that's wild. And you go, that was the norm back in the day. It really was. There were people who had different ideas than we have today. That's just the way it was. So you look at a person like Columbus, and you say, well, Columbus came to the New World, and then he wound up making some slaves out of natives, or he started a chain which allowed people to make some slaves out of natives. And you say, well, that's bad. Columbus had slaves. This is terrible. He's the worst. We can't celebrate him. And you say, okay, slavery was ubiquitous throughout the world. It really was. There were not a lot of people in the year 1492 who were abolitionists when it came to slavery. Slavery was common in Europe. It was all throughout Asia. It was in Africa. It was everywhere. So you say, well, okay, so no person was good prior to when? 1865? That was the first time that people were decent and good because slavery was illegal in this country at that point? Okay, maybe not a good argument because, well, why is that? I have always been anti taking the statues down of people like Columbus for that reason where we can't judge them by today's standards. Oh, Columbus did bad things. That's not why we celebrate him. We celebrate Columbus because he was the person who was brave enough to sail across an ocean when people believed that the world was flat and say, no, I think we'll hit the other side. I think it'd be fine. And he wound up, I don't think he ever made, at least in his initial voyage, I don't think he ever landed on the continental United States. I think he was just down in the Caribbean. But he was the one who did it. That's why we celebrate him. He was the one who was brave enough to explore and go forth and find land where people thought there was nothing, thought he was going to sail off the edge of the earth, thought he was going to be sucked down by some giant sea kraken. And that's why we celebrate him. A guy like George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, if your sum total of him as a moral person is that George Washington had slaves, Thomas Jefferson had slaves, they can't be moral. I guarantee you, I promise you this, if you lived in the 1700s, you would not be more moral than George Washington. You're a fool if you think that's true. You are a product of the society that you live in. We don't celebrate George Washington because he had slaves. We celebrate George Washington because he was the person who led the Continental Army against Britain and made America what it is. He was the first president of the United States. He was the first person, maybe in history, with the moral character to say, hey, do you want to be king? And he says no. Can you imagine a person like that? Could you be that person? If somebody said, hey, we've decided to make you emperor of the United States, are you the kind of person who could say, no, I don't want absolute power? Most people are not that person. He was that person. Thomas Jefferson was more educated than almost anyone who lives today. The guy didn't understand, electricity. He didn't understand the automobile. He didn't have these things. But he, I guarantee you, was smarter when it came to philosophy and politics and religion than 99% of people on Earth 300 years later, okay? So this idea that we're going to just hate Columbus because slavery existed in the 1400s is so asinine. It is so stupid. And to pretend that Columbus was some sort of genocidal maniac is just a misread of history. Disease is what killed most of the Native American population. It just is. And that's not the fault of Europeans. That's just the fault of when civilizations come together, sometimes this is the case. It's not Columbus's fault. He wasn't committing genocide. This isn't trying to give smallpox blankets to the Indians, which is something that happened. This is, we made contact, and because people were segregated on different continents, they grew up with different diseases. And the Native Americans had no immunity. And when they were met with these diseases, they died. It's not Columbus's fault. You can't blame him for that. It's not the way that it works. Obviously, there were, I remember reading one time, and my number here could be wrong, but I believe it's close to correct. Before the Europeans landed in the Americas, so before they really came over here and started to populate North America, where we think of America today, the native population had died off by something like 90%. So when people landed, what they found was these places that were kind of already cleared out, kind of easy to cultivate, land that was already worked, crops that were already growing in some places, or at least given the opportunity to grow because the land had been taken care of in a certain way. And so they said, oh, America's kind of easy. It's great over here because all this stuff is just coming really easy. And it turned out, well, no, all the natives had already died prior to Europeans coming over and colonizing. So there was just these big empty areas where they landed. This is not always the case. This is not to say mistakes were not made. This is not to say that there wasn't clashes of civilization. Of course that happened. That always happens when civilizations meet. But the term colonizer is so dumb because they use it as a pejorative. It's thrown out like you're a bad person. Oh, the ancestors were colonizers. Look at you. First of all, I prefer the term conqueror. That's what white Europeans did. They came over and they conquered. I'm sorry, you lost. That's just the way it goes. Clashes of civilizations have happened throughout history. The stronger civilization wins. The lesser civilization fades into obscurity. That's just the way it goes. Columbus did a great thing when he discovered the Americas. That's why we celebrate him. That's why we celebrate great men. If you want to say Columbus isn't a great man, all I'd say is, what have you done for the world? Columbus opened up the world, which I think we'll all agree, at least I would hope most people would agree, is a net positive for the world. If we managed to make it to today and we had never made contact, so it's 2024, we're still in Europe, the Native Americans are still in North America, what do we think the world would look like? Do we think it'd be better or worse if we just didn't know each other? That's the alternative here that we're talking about. So Native Americans are running around the Americas, and the Europeans are just in Europe, and Africans are just in Africa. Does the world look better or worse? Do we think that globalization is good or bad? Because I don't know how we have it both ways. By the way, the party that hates calling anyone illegal is really keen on saying Europeans had no right to this land. I don't see how you square that circle. I thought that, the border is not a problem. Illegal immigration is not a problem. All I know is my ancestors came over from Europe and landed here in America at some point, and I want to know, hey, we're all immigrants, right? Isn't that fine? We're all supposed to be good and well and done. I also, and the other thing, obviously I'm being a little cheeky. The other thing that always bothers me is this idea of the enlightened native. The Aztecs were down there murdering thousands of people, cutting virgin hearts out while they're still beating and throwing them down the stairs of their temple. And we're supposed to believe, oh, well, this is all good. The Spanish were really the problem when they conquered those people. No, I don't think so. I think the Europeans did a good thing to end the practice of human sacrifice among native tribes. I think that's probably good. It's like when Britain ended the practice of, I think it's called sati, the burning of wives on their husband's funeral pyre that they used to be practiced in India. The British, when they colonized, quote unquote, colonized India, they said, hey, you're not allowed to burn women at the stake because their husbands die anymore. And people said, what? How could you? This is cultural. No, Britain just shut it down. I think that was good for the world. So I think that's why we celebrate Columbus, Kamala Harris. It's not because the West is terrible and evil and bad and everything we touch turns to ash. It's because Columbus did an amazing, great, brave thing that made the world a better place in the long run. And more than I will say that you are capable of or will ever do. Anyway, that's my little Columbus Day rant. I do it every year. I get upset about Columbus Day every year. Columbus, he's a great Italian explorer and an American hero. All right. Anyway, we're going to leave it there for the week. As always, people, questions, comments, concerns, leave them down in the comments. I will read them off on the podcast next week. And until next Friday, hope you guys have a great time, and I'll see you then.